On Christmas Day, a pretty dramatic story about a secret U.S. military strike in Nigeria just blew up online. It was specific, it was emotional, and it spread like wildfire. But how was this story built to be so powerful? Well, that's what we're going to do here. We're going to deconstruct that very narrative piece by piece.
So, it all kicked off with this one incredibly powerful claim, a single statement that framed a military action as a promise fulfilled, and it just exploded. Now, our focus here isn't on the facts of the strike itself. Instead, we're going to look at how this compelling story was put together to be so incredibly shareable.
Okay, so it all began with this single dramatic announcement made on the Truth Social platform. Right from the get-go, the stakes were just incredibly high. This wasn't framed as just another military operation. No, this was a righteous mission to stop the vicious killing of Christians. That kind of framing immediately sets up this really clear, really emotional good versus evil storyline.
So, how exactly was this narrative put together? Let's, break down its anatomy. Okay, so when you look closely, the whole story was really built on four key pillars. You've got its symbolic timing, a really clear and noble cause, a sense of massive historical stakes, and finally, the use of some very specific, very evocative language. Let's dig into each one.
First up, the timing. Think about it. The announcement drops on Christmas Day. And the narrative makes it really clear. This was no accident. It was framed as a deliberate act of defense for Christians on their most sacred day, which basically transforms a military event into something symbolic, almost mythic.
All right, next up, the cause. The story sets up this super simple hero and villain dynamic. This wasn't about complex geopolitics. It was about protecting innocent Christians from terrorist scum. And that kind of black and white clarity makes a story just so easy to get behind and to share.
And then, wow, they really ramp up the historical stakes. The announcement claimed this level of violence hadn't been seen for many years and even centuries. Just that one word, centuries, it completely reframes the whole thing, right? It turns it into this event of massive historical importance. And finally, let's talk about the language, because this is fascinating. The announcement kept using the term Department of War. Now, that name was officially changed way back in 1949, so why use it? Well, it gives this sense of old-school gravity, a kind of authority, like it's channeling a more decisive, straightforward era. But look, for a story this big to really stick, it has to feel credible, right? And that's where the backstory comes into play. And that's exactly what the narrative did. If you look at this timeline, you can see a very deliberate sequence of events was laid out. First, there's this public warning back in November. Then you get reports of U.S. surveillance flights, gathering intel. And finally, boom, the Christmas Day strike. See how that timeline suggests this was all planned out? A legitimate military op, not just some impulsive act. But this is where the story of collaboration gets a little more complicated. On one hand, the narrative claimed it was a partnership, right? It talked about the Nigerian government's support. And yeah, some news reports seemed to back that up. But then other reports started popping up, with sources expressing, skepticism, even calling it a one-sided attack. This really shows how the story's legitimacy was being built up in one place while being questioned somewhere else. Okay, so beyond just building a backstory for this one event, the narrative did something else that was really strategically important. See, the Nigeria story wasn't just presented on its own, in a vacuum. It was bundled. This strategy is often called bundling. Basically, the Airstrike claim was just one piece of this fire hose of information. A whole flood of other really intense social media posts all dropped on the same day. And the effect of that? It's kind of cognitive overload. It makes it almost impossible for anyone to focus on and critically analyze any one single claim. So, let's look at the pieces. First, you have the main story, the core claim, a triumphant announcement about numerous perfect strikes, presented as this huge military and moral victory. And then, bam, at the very same time, the whole conversation just pivots on a dime. The narrative immediately connects to these accusations about Jeffrey Epstein, targeting political opponents and promising all these damaging revelations. The tone is just as intense, but the subject? It's a completely different universe. And to top it all off, the whole thing gets bundled with these familiar attacks on domestic political rivals and old controversies, like the Russia hoax. So you see what's happening here, right? You've got foreign policy,
conspiracy theories, and domestic politics all just woven together into one single, nonstop stream of information.
So, when you put all of these pieces together, the timing, the cause, the backstory, and this bundling strategy, what's the end result? Let's break down why this narrative actually worked so well. When you really boil it all down, what you're left with is this very simple, very heroic picture. You have a strong leader who takes decisive action. He acts, seemingly alone, to protect the persecuted. He punishes the bad guys. And this is absolutely crucial. His story is positioned as the real truth, and you're warned ahead of time that the media is going to try and spin. And all of this really leaves us with one crucial question to think about. When a story about, say, a secret military strike gets bundled together with domestic politics and wild conspiracies, how does that packaging change what we as the audience are ultimately willing to believe?